Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the 9th in the series of EVA broadcasts. And today we welcome Nat Moyes, who will be interviewing David Hancock of the Infrastructure and Projects Authority, Director responsible for construction things, and joining us from his living room, I think, by the looks of it. So not down in Whitehall. Looking forward to a great conversation. Nat's prepared some fine questions. We'll let the conversation roll on. If I could ask those who aren't speaking to turn their video off, please. I shall also be muting you all until we get to Q&A after about half an hour. So really, without further ado, have I told you the recording's on? If I haven't, we're now recording. I shall reappear in about half an hour, so see you then. So over to you, Nat. Welcome.
Great, thank you, Steve. Good evening, everybody. My name is Natalie Moyes. I work for a company called Deltec. Some of the people on here I'll know, some I don't. So the reason why we're doing this today is Deltec have supported Steve's event for the past 13 years. And when we were talking to Steve about the sessions that we were doing, he wanted to do something a bit different, something that was a bit more discussion-based, just a flowing conversation, very much like the conversations that I would have standing on the booth at Armories Hall, eating lunch, drinking coffee, and so on and so forth. So we chose a participant, and that was David. So this is not about us sharing a PowerPoint with you, saying that you should and shouldn't do things. It's basically talking about topical questions, and some of my questions have come from posting on LinkedIn and asking colleagues and other clients what kinds of things are topical for them, and then just seeing where the conversation goes. So it really is straight off our cuff, and I will hand over to David for his introduction.
Thank you, Natalie. David Hancock. I'm the construction director at the IPA. Prior to that, risk manager at TfL for the Olympics. I was also the risk manager on Terminal 5, going back a long time. A director with Halcro, various other bits and pieces, and I once wrote a book on risk.
Yes, you did. And I went into, I did go into Amazon, and I had a bit of a read through and a peruse of all of the reviews, should I say, and there was one that was very, very, I have to say, it did go straight over my head, but I did have a question on that, but I thought we might finish on risk.
Okay.
So the questions that we kind of put together, and I shared them with you beforehand, were very much about the kind of practical things that projects can do. So for those that weren't involved in the 5 minutes before Steve lit them into the meeting, we were talking about the number of different reports that have come out. So there's a report that's been out in the last month or so that talks about mega projects and how they're successful in some ways and perhaps not successful in others. And obviously I'm trying to be careful because, you know, you never know who's worked on said projects. But it always dials down to perhaps the same 4 root areas: scope, planning, managing interdependencies, and oversight. And one of the things that Steve was talking about was, you know, do we run projects in the same way? How do you get that innovation in? So what are your thoughts on kind of making projects different to how we've done them previously before, and how do we bring that into our projects team?
First of all, I think there's a difference between mega projects and big projects. Mega projects are not really just a big project. I've done a project, therefore we'll do exactly the same, just on a bigger scale. I think mega projects are more like transitionary organizations, where they're there for, maybe some mega projects are there for longer than companies exist for. So you're almost looking at running a small organization with all of the things around HR, motivation, and all those things that go together. So, you know, we shouldn't expect the fact that because we built a shed at the bottom of the garden, we can build a Terminal 5 at the end of Heathrow. And then it's motivating the people over a long period of time to see your vision, because quite often we start with a vision.
Mm-hmm.
Or we should start with a vision, and being able to maintain that for a long period of time. And I also think people miss miscomprehend the difference between complexity and complicated. So by complicated, what I mean is what I would call systems complexity, which is something like IKEA furniture to building an aircraft carrier, which is if you put all the component parts together, you should end up with exactly the same thing at the end of it. Whereas complex is different. You can start from the same starting conditions and actually end up with a successful project or a unsuccessful project, even with the same people, because just a small change will actually make a difference to your project. And we don't have a way of treating them any different. We kind of generalize with projects. And I think, personally, I think a project that is a railway is very different to a project for building a 23-story building. You know, I'm lucky, I work in government, I work across a variety of projects. I would say railways are closer to building ships than they are to building buildings. And so it's that kind of understanding that you really need to bring at the front end to say, what type of project am I?
It's interesting because I remember reading something on kind of high speed 1, so kind of the Eurotunnel, Crossrail, HS2, and all 3 of those projects were fundamentally different in the way that or I suppose in the way that they perceived from a success perspective, versus the fact that they're all still building relative high speed train, be it above ground or underground. One of the questions that I had from my wider network was about transparency, and he was specifically talking about kind of Crossrail and transparency. And again, you talked about that kind of vision piece. Do you think transparency is a good, bad, or ugly kind of thing from a project? Do we need more of it? Do we need to see exactly what's going on from a social perspective, as in, you know, us people at home that will be using the rail?
See, I don't think you need more of it. I just think you need the right transparency. So, you know, people talk about Crossrail. Andrew Wolstenholme, I worked with Andrew on Terminal 5. I'd like, you know, when we talk about successful projects, constantly Terminal 5 comes up as a successful project, which people look at. So, you know, people say about transparency, and it's understanding the data that comes out. So, for instance, and the reason I talk about railways being closer to ships is in a ship, and I worked on the aircraft carrier, the Q2, it is still on trials, 18 months, nearly 2 years. We're still doing commissioning on it, right? Nobody questions us about the fact that it's going round. We have to, yet if you turn around and say we're going to commission a railway for 2 years, people are like, what on earth are you doing? You know, and I think where we got confused was the physical build. So the physical build of Crossrail was probably at 98% complete. But anybody who's done a railway will tell you that's the easy bit. Getting a railway to run, now that's difficult, because all you have to do is look at what happened with the timetabling changes in South West Rail, and you can see and all they changed was a timetable. They had a running railway. And so in some cases, I think we don't understand the type of the beast we're dealing with, and we don't want to. In some cases, there is a drive towards determinism driven by newspapers, driven by everything, to say, you know, tell me on what date, with how much money, you will complete, you know, Crossrail by, and I will hold you to it. And in some cases, that's just not fair.
True, although with the Olympics, they really did have to hold to a specific date. I mean, the budget may have fluctuated, but they did have to stay to a particular date. So maybe there are some lessons learned from that particular project, because I know you mentioned the Olympics.
But again, commissioning on the Olympics, you know, it's not the same as commissioning a railway, which is you've got to get trains to run with people on and off them. Yeah. You know,
can't just shut that site down and say no. Nobody can do anything because it's a clean slate, so to speak.
Yeah, so those kind of things, and even with the Olympics, some of the people will tell you that the Olympics long term, you know, we've had to clear up some bits and pieces to turn it into housing, for instance, you know, and schooling. So
is it West Ham football team that had wasn't there a football team that took over one of the?
And there was all sorts of arguments about, you know, whether they should get it, did they get the right price? So I think one of the things is you've got to look at the type of project. With the Olympic Games, everybody knew what it was. You know, what we were striving for, and it was. You're right. It was a day. Cost, well, everybody said the cost went up, but in actual fact, you know, it was probably bid for because the idea was to win the games against other people. So it would have been bid at and the project will be win the games. It would have been bid at what I would call a Lidl games or an Aldi games, you know.
Yeah.
Knowing full well that when we got it, we would want a Waitrose or a Marks and Spencer's games.
Yeah, I was thinking Marks and Spencer's games, the Marks and Spencer's.
And so, you know, I think in some cases we have to be truthful with what we've got and what we're trying to achieve. And if we want the games, you know, then it's kind of one of those things. If you want it, you win it. You want to do well at it. You know, and we look back on it, and you know, everybody looks back at 2012 and says, you know, fantastic. What it did for Paralympics is phenomenal. You know, the amount of people that went there. There was never an empty stadium when you've seen in other places empty stadiums. The transportation network worked around it. There's a whole infrastructure that went around it. You know, and we're back to your definition of success.
I mean, it was really, you know, the whole kind of country pulled into that, because I think everybody could really understand what it was. What's the project? What are we delivering? What are we going to get? And then what are the next steps that kind of come from that? When you were talking about that vision piece, and I know Steve is quite a hot topic for him a couple of years ago, was the benefit statement and being able to realise the benefits and so on and so forth. I wonder if some projects perhaps lose that clarity sometimes. And so in comes the UK papers with their doom and gloom, and people kind of get that negative response to it, whereas it was very difficult to become negative with the amount of positive that we had at the back of the Olympics. I think, again, kind of perception and the way that people buy into to their projects is quite important. It kind of plays back to a lot of things that I heard when I was on the APM SIGs, when we were talking about kind of communication across project teams and just the motivation and just the way that people come together to get things done and move it forward. Trying to think about some other kind of questions.
Well, I mean, again, when you're on that, if you talk about benefits, and I agree with Steve, which is, you know, cost, time and quality, you know, cost and time seem to be, we're nailed down by, when in actual fact, you know, a lot of projects now are about social, you know, the stuff we're doing in government now, net zero, you know, we've got to get, you know, we've got to reduce the carbon. It's got to have social. We're talking about levelling up across, you know, because of the, you know, what we're seeing with COVID is how unequal the country is financially. And so a lot of our projects now have a much wider gamut than ever we had before. And I think, you know, the cost, time, quality, the problem is the quality side of it is many dimensional. The cost and time, it's easy to measure, isn't it? You know, were you late? And people can beat you with a big stick if you're late. Did you overspend? And people can beat you with a big stick. But some of the quality stuff is in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah, you know, sledgehammers, nuts, you know, what do you need for the location that you're in, and so on and so forth. And then obviously the cost then for being part of that, like with the rail, the cost of your rail ticket in certain parts of the country can differ massively, and all of that is part of your projects. It's quite a nice segue into kind of pace, that let's get some pace into our projects, people, let's speed up. But then how do you manage those three pillars without damaging one or t'other?
And so, I mean, so Project Speed, which is, you may have heard about Project Speed, which was driven initially by Number 10 and brought in by Dominic Cummins, and that, which is saying, does it really take all this time? You know, some of it is bureaucracy, you know, of how long it takes. You know, I remember Terminal 5, you know, it started when they actually the model that they wanted, by the time they got to actually start on site, what they'd asked for wasn't what they wanted, because technology had changed. You know, we had the A380 came in, so we had double deck piers, and you don't want to design something for, you know, the last.
Mm-hmm.
So with Pace is looking at stuff and saying, do we really need to take this amount of time? But at the same time, it's not lean, because what it's asking ourselves is, are there things in there that need to be there? Do we have things that actually help us? So almost like, if you think like fire breaks in forests, you know, if you came along and said, well, actually, look, that's a waste of space, we could plant trees in it, but they're there for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the same with, you know, it's how closely coupled are events, and if something goes wrong, what can we do about it? Because in some cases, what we found is with supply chains, we've leaned them so much that they're all right in normal working conditions. But when you get something like a volcano, you know, a tidal wave, you've got to ask yourself, and this is where risk comes in, of future-proofing it and saying, what if this happened? And again, you know, I can give an example on the Olympics where we put in resilience, and by resilience, that means you're putting in extra money, redundancy, and that, and on the travel network, so that if one part of the network went down, we knew we could bring people in, because it was so important to get people to the Olympics. And that's not just, you know, the athletes are important, the judges are important, the people are important, the people who sell hot dogs are important. So we knew it was so important that we actually built redundancy around the Olympic Park for people to come in if part of the railway network went down or part of the underground went down. And sometimes I feel that people take things out,
Mm-hmm.
and lean almost on the financial bit, and then bank the money, rather than saying, but actually that's giving me a bit of time to think, or it's giving me a stopper, or it's giving me some resilience against risk. And again, that's the kind of thing you need to understand your system in order to understand the resilience you need to have in it.
So there was a quote from your book. Let's have a read through. It said, the general perception among project and risk managers is that we somehow control the future, which is, in your opinion, one of the most ill-conceived ideas in risk management. So I suppose it's not that it's not about mapping out and controlling. It's about making sure that you have that time and space to be able to think, what do we need to do, and kind of giving yourself that time, because risk seems to be a hot topic at the moment. Lots of people, I mean, thank you, global pandemic, but risk is definitely a hot topic. We're definitely seeing a lot of people saying, and I think Stephen mentioned it earlier as well, schedule risk analysis is not new, but it's definitely getting a new breadth of life.
Yeah, and I still believe that, because what we want somehow is we want to believe that we can control, that by doing what we do, we will control the future, where in actual fact, we can't. What we can do is try and say, well, what could happen in the future, and what might I do that would mitigate it if it happened? So, you know, COVID was not, I mean, I get really annoyed when people tell me COVID was a black swan. COVID was not a black swan. Everybody knew that a pandemic was going to happen. What we didn't say is, and what infrastructure do we need to put in place to do that? And Harvey Mailer, who's at Cranfield, and I have this thing, which is, we're trying to get people to move from predict and provide, which is predict risks and then provide money to pay for them, to predict and prevent, which is predict the risks that may or may not occur, and then say, what can I put in place to prevent it or reduce the consequence of it happening, or to, first of all, to catch it early, because it's nothing worse than saying, oh yeah, I knew that. But then have it there so that you knew what you were going to do if it occurred.
So having your fire breaks, in a way, putting your fire breaks in.
Yeah.
And not building trees in there because you think it's an easier thing to do.
Absolutely. But understanding it well enough to say, A, this is happening. So if we look at tunneling, when we do a tunnel, we put accelerometers on there to say where we think it's collapsing or whether it gets, and we do statistical process engineering, which will be red, amber, green. You know, as we're tunneling along, we know the ground will fluctuate because that's just what it does. But as long as it stays within these parameters, it's green, then it goes to amber, and you need to do something. And if it's red, you stop. The same kind of thing should be applied to project, which is, you know, here is something that we're doing. Oh my God, this isn't going right. Well, then let's stop doing it, have a think, and maybe do something differently.
Do you think projects are dynamic enough to be able to realise quick enough that something's not going right? Let's stop, let's look at it. You know, that drumbeat, which is the monthly drumbeat, sometimes isn't monthly. And sometimes you're a bit too far into that money pit to be able to say, hang on a second, let's just sit and have a look at this.
But see, if you want a type of project, and this is where in the book Wicked Problems and stuff, the only way you can know is by fast feedback loops. You have to have that feedback. You have to know, and you know, we're starting to do that. I know Mace is starting to have these communication rooms now, whereby as you go along, automatically, and then you do it, because that's the type of dynamic world we live in. Waiting a month to have a meeting, you know, or it'll be all right, you know. I was brought into T5. I was working in Copenhagen after the Heathrow Express collapse, and things like tunnel collapses don't wait for you to have a meeting. They don't say, well, hold on a minute, we'll just wait for you to sort out what you're going to do about it. And I think in some cases we do need that almost instant feedback, and forward looking rather than a lot of our metrics are backwards looking. So they say, oh, well, how did we do last month on the, I don't know, on the tunneling advance, or how much money did we spend last month? And you
congratulate yourself that you've got this far, but the boat's sinking now. But hey, we got this far.
Yeah,
not really looking at the fact that the boat's sinking.
So some of the, you know, some of the things have to be forward looking, and because none of us can predict the future, there has to be a level of uncertainty around that prediction of what you're going to happen, what's going to happen in the future. And we're going to have to live with it depends, which I know people hate, but in these type of problems, and the projects are getting more and more complex. You know, I looked at the aircraft, as I say, I worked on the aircraft carrier, on the risk side of the aircraft carrier. They had to build a ship when they didn't even know what the plane was going to be like that was going to land on it. I mean, that's the QE2, you know, the Americans still hadn't designed the aircraft, the Lightning 3. They hadn't designed Lightning 2. Sorry, they hadn't designed it when we were building the carrier.
Yeah, the slingshot versus. Yeah, I remember all of that. That was
you know,
projects.
And we've done, you know, it's done really well. The last NAO report, it's fantastic. When you do well, the NAO report, I think, was one line that said, you did very well on the carrier. However,
there's always a but. There's never just a congratulations.
Well, some of the supporting stuff, like some of the IT, some of the radar stuff, isn't ready. You know, and I think that's one of the things, that if you do things well, you get 2 lines. If you do badly, you get an NAO report that lasts for 36 pages.
Well, that's is that not the British way, though? Everybody sometimes is a little bit more happy to talk about bad news than they are to talk about good. But yeah, there's definitely a lot about speed and being able to share as things become more complex and data becomes bigger and there's more systems, and now we have a cloud and multiple clouds that all talk to each other. How do you think technology is going to kind of play into this, the artificial intelligence discussions that have been going on for the last 6 months in our kind of general sphere?
I think in some cases it's quite good. I mean, I think it's one of the company's nodes and links and nodes, which is looking at those and trying to, but it'll never replace judgment. So it can only inform judgment. You know, what we shouldn't let it do is make the decisions for us. What we should allow it to do is to inform our decision making. Because as far as I'm aware, AI can't even predict who's going to win the football league, which should be a small amount of inputs. But you know, we're looking at football teams in the Premiership and that, and it can't predict those. So it can give us insight. It can help us look at things. Remember, first of all, it's programmed by humans, so I suspect there'll be some human error in it. I think in some cases it can make us, actually, it can be bad for us because we fall back on it. And again, I'll look at Crossrail. So commissioning is a physical thing really on railways that takes a long time, but somehow we digitally commission and convince ourselves that we can run a digital train set and it'll all work first time, you know, because the digital work does. But of course you then get into running a train in a tunnel, and you suddenly find out, you know, how much difficult it is, what speeds you can run it at, what the air radiuses are, how people are interpreting it. So I think we have to be very aware of that. Digital twins, I think, are going to be fantastic if we start to move to standard products. And that's where I think we're going to move to, especially within government, is more standardization. Because with standardization, I can give you certainty. If I've done it 4 or 5 times, if I've built 4 or 5 schools, I know it works. I know they're getting good academic qualifications at the end of it, or then I can repeat it in the same way that you would repeat an iPhone, you repeat your laptop or something, or even your cars. You know, they're all mass customized, but you can't choose anything that goes with it, because there'll be certain engines that don't go with gearboxes, that don't go with wheels. You know, we need to bring that into our industry, because I think people know there are certain components that shouldn't go with other components. So I think digitization, standardization, and harmonizing those kind of things across the industry will help us, and starting to bring digital twins. I think it'll be a fantastic
stuff to come. So one of the things, or one of the questions that I had from my network was around kind of senior leadership. So when you're talking about standardization, it's, you know, if you've got a senior leader that's perhaps done this before and understands kind of that project controls, but I know I hear from a lot of clients and a lot of colleagues that project control still doesn't get the kudos, if you like, that it needs, let alone the oversight or the instruction that we're going to do it in this way, and we're going to receive the information in that concept that it's ever changing and people have done it differently, and I want to do it this way. Or you've got a CEO that doesn't really understand the project controls reporting that's going up there. I think one of the NIO reports was definitely that risk was something that was underestimated and not well understood at that senior management. So if you're a project controls director on the call, what kind of advice do you have on working towards that standardization and getting that buy-in from above?
So I think some of it's almost like, for me, projects are almost like apprenticeships, you know, where we used to have masters and that going, you become a master, you know, at your trade, if you like. And for me, project management and project controls are trades, you know, that's our trade. And what you have to show is a track record of moving off simple to less than simple to complex to, you know, bigger projects. And you can move between rail projects to shipping, and I know that some of the people on T5 were on the and some of the shipping programs and that. And you have to have, in the same way, you have to have some kind of ability for a CEO to be able to talk to them, for them to understand what it is that you do. I sometimes think we talk too technically at them, and we explain technically, and I go back to a long time ago. I did some work in Bath, in Bath Spa, about the catacombs, and all that stone that you see that's beautiful in the Crescent actually came from underground and under some people's houses.
And they had to refill it, didn't they? Because it was starting.
Well, there were two groups were explaining how to refill it. One of them said, "Oh, we're going to fill it full of fly ash, and it's 25% this, and it will only have a certain this, and this will go down, and this is the technical specification." And the other group came along and said, well, actually, we're going to blow foam in there. As you can see, we're going to fill it up with foam. There will be, and they talked in kind of less technical, but more things that people could, and guess who won the contract? You know, not the people who were probably technically more astute at it, but the people who could speak the language. And one of the things I don't like about maturity models is maturity model kind of says number of stakeholders. What it doesn't talk about is the difference in language between an engineer and a member of the public, or even an engineer and a politician, or an engineer and a CEO. There has to be bridging that goes on. Engineers, you could have civil engineers talking to mechanical engineers, talking to you know, you could have all sorts, but if they're all engineering, they come from an engineering background, they kind of get what they're talking about.
Yeah.
But there is this behavioural side, and for me, behavioural risk is really poorly done, of understanding how to tell somebody what it is that we do. And storytelling is one of those things for me, which is undervalued. And I guess, you know, one of the things I try to do with this interview is tell the story of T5 or tell the story of the Olympics, which people get and they go, okay, I get that. But you've got to have a story with a moral, a vision and a kind of thing and put it together so that people understand what project controls actually bring to the party.
It's interesting because, again, back to the kind of APM tables, and we talk about STEM, and then you look at where people come from when they get into project controls. One of the things that's always been said on those round tables is communication is really important, motivation is there. And then you say, well, how many people do you recruit that sole piece was about communications? We don't draw from degrees where your main job is how to articulate, to communicate, to motivate. We're still STEM. It's got to be maths, got to be engineers. So when you have a lot of engineer people, perhaps that's something that, you know, industry should be looking at, changing the types of people and the way that they communicate. Not everybody needs to be able to, you know, draw up a blueprint, but perhaps somebody needs to be able to communicate that blueprint to non-engineers.
Yeah, and we run the Major Projects Leadership Academy in government, which takes SROs, which are not project deliverers, they are the people who kind of set the environment, and take some project, but actually talk to them and take them away. And they've got, you know, we have 180 odd GMP major, I mean, they are major projects, everything from universal credits to building aircraft carriers to protecting our borders. And we take those people away and we do an 18-month course and they have to write 5 papers about projects and that, actually getting them together to understand each other, to be able, and we try and give them some project management inkling. We don't try and turn them into project managers or project directors. What we try and do is bridge the gap, what we call, or Tony Meggs called the valley of death between policy and delivery, which is, you know, people in government, because at the end of the day, government is about policy and making people's lives better. You know, and projects are a way to realise that, and the gap between it, and that's why the Leadership Academy is really quite important. And we're sending ministers now on a shortened version because they also set the environment.
Yeah, and they're also the ones that are communicating out as well. So with, you know, Twitter and all of those wonderful communication platforms, there's so many different ways in which you can engage stakeholders, both within a project and then the people that will recognise the benefits of said project. It's a really key piece. I think the Olympics did it very well. Some other major projects, perhaps not quite so much. But looking at the time, because I know Steve wants to jump in, and the point of this is I'm sure there's loads and loads of questions that's going to come from the floor. But my final question would be, you've talked about some of the really interesting projects that you've worked on. So we've talked about the Olympics and the aircraft carriers and so on and so forth. Which project were you not on that you wish you were, and why?
Gosh. Probably the genome problem, you know, which is, well, the genome is, you know, working out, because it doesn't have an answer. And I like, most of my projects, at least at some point, have a physical thing that are built at the end of it. Whereas something like the working out the structure of running a project, for working out the structure of DNA and those kind of things, you don't know what the answer is. And it's really quite, when you get there, you'll only know because you've got there and people will tell you. So those kind of scientific things, which are far more experimental, would challenge me in my thinking.
Yeah, because it's never been done before, so it's complete kind of new experience, new processes, new communication channels. Good luck getting the funding though, if you don't know how long it's going to go for. We don't know what we're building, we don't know what we're going to end up, but we think it'd be really good to do.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much. I do want to make sure that anybody on the call has time for questions, but I'm not supposed to be fielding questions. That is our glorious leader, Mr. Wake.
Thank you. Thank you both very much. I feel dreadful pulling this up, but again, we said use the word less is more, and I think leave them begging for more. Really interesting stuff. I'm going to selfishly ask you a question before I hand it over to the others here, David. And I wonder whether this has occurred to you either. I know that you're considerably younger than me, but I got into this game 30 years ago, 35 years ago, and assumed a relatively senior, or I felt I was anyway, getting involved in big stuff. And influential stuff, leveraging off the APM and other institutions to try and get things done and to try and change things, and getting involved in large projects. I must confess to my shame, whilst we've both grown up and we're surrounded by our peers who've all kind of grown up, in the same time frame, I'm just wondering where those 30, 35-year-olds are now, and what can, should, and must be done in order for them to pick up, what we will inevitably have to leave to somebody else, hopefully in a better state than we did. Do you have any thoughts on the sort of promotion of that, or are we looking in the wrong place? In some ways, is adherence to bodies of knowledge and standards and codes of practice in some way cotton wool that's stultifying the the willingness of younger people, dare I say, to get involved? Don't know, but I think it worries me. It's something that does preoccupy me.
Yeah, I mean, I meet loads of young people that really, are doing brilliantly, and especially, Institute of Civil Engineers, people that are apprentices in government, along those lines. And I believe that apprenticeship is the best way. I do believe we have a trade as project managers. Some of us we've all got scars that we carry on our back from projects that haven't gone so well, or we've learnt from them. But I do think that there are a lot of young people who are taking up the challenges. I'm quite lucky that I get to do a lot of award ceremonies, and you look at the people there, and more so as I see more women coming through, which I think is fantastic, because I've been in an industry, construction industry, which has at the best had 12%, but you see them coming through. You see young people have got digital skills that they get, without having to think about BIM or whatever, which the BIM framework. They've come out with digital skills, and they're asking the questions of why don't we have digital twins? Why haven't you got one of these? Where is your this? So I'm pretty excited about the future, really. I do think it's hard to get to be, to lead one of these major projects, because there aren't many around, and you have to have a small project to move on to a bigger project.
Sure.
I don't think being dropped in, we've tried dropping people in at the top of it, and they haven't always succeeded.
Sure, yeah. Okay, all right. Well, I suppose just one supplement to that, and it came up in the conversation last week. I agree organisations are getting better at being more inclusive and more diverse. What they're still not very good at is retaining, because unfortunately they get this bigger mix of people joining organisations, but the prevailing culture within the organisations appears to be still not changed, and it's not those new arrivals that I think should be. I think some of these new arrivals are being used as the instrument with the hope that they're going to change the culture, rather than seeing that in certain instances the actual prevailing culture needs to be altered and worked from the other side of the wall as well before people arrive. And I'm just wondering whether a lot of effort to encourage people in is going to waste because of that. And again, not got a solution other than to say that we need to work a great deal harder at that being on the receiving end of this stuff, but and also to encourage still the recruitment into that system. But do note that there are large organisations that aren't very good at bringing about those changes, maybe because they're full of people who don't welcome that. Don't know. But,
I'll just answer that quick, because I think at the top they all say the right, they're all wanting to do the same thing.
Yeah.
At the bottom, there seems to be some kind of treacle in the middle.
Yeah.
That isn't changing, Steve. For me, there is, it's some middle band somewhere.
Yeah.
That is the blocker.
Yeah. Well, again, one way you do that is you squeeze it. And you as we've heard before, you flatten the hierarchy. You take out those layers, which doesn't mean to say that there isn't a role for those people that might get squashed in there. But you make everybody far more competent and capable and able. So I've used the phrase that I always thought that one of the aims and objectives of the project of the APM was ultimately to disappear project management, in the sense that everybody could be a project manager, rather than it being something that you took off the shelf and brought in. Yes, there are individual skills and techniques, but largely everybody should have the potential and the competence to do the sorts of things that we do to successfully deliver and manage, and as you said, mitigate the delivery of these things that we call projects, but could also be spread further into everyday life. Anyway, forgive me, I must throw this open before I get chucked out myself. Has anybody got a question for David, or Nat even, or me? Please put your hand up if you do, and I'll endeavour to spot you and call you in. Bob Arnolds. Hello, Bob.
Yes, thanks. Hello, Steve. Thanks, Natalie and David. That was brilliant. You talked about the inevitability that as projects, or mega projects anyway, as they progress, there are elements that need to be re-evaluated, and ultimately it might result in extra time, cost, that kind of thing. But nevertheless, at some point before all of that, some parties signed contracts that said that they could cope with it without having disturbance through these inevitabilities. Do you think in government there's anything, I presume that I'm right on that sort of thing, but I just wondered, assuming I'm right, is there anything that government or other leading bodies could do to achieve contracts that reflect what you actually do in reality?
In some cases you have to have a base, David. It's a brilliant question, but you have to have a base case, don't you? You have to have something to start from, of which to, because we have to go to competitive tender. So let's talk about the way we get jobs, which is, it goes out to competition. So there has to be some way of doing that. But if we start to look at having then got early contractor involvement, if I look at C5, we had adult conversations between the people there. Norman Haste and various, Ray O'Rourke. On Terminal 5, there used to be a company called Lang's. Some people will remember them, and they went bust in the middle of it. We had grown-up conversations because things changed, where the contract was, we said, look, this is inevitably going to have to change. And people said, yeah, but this is all I can afford. And so we had grown-up conversations to come up with a product and a way forward that would allow both those things to happen. So allow things to change, but also within a budget, which is, I call it kitchen economics. It's about if you build a kitchen and you decide, I don't know, the oven costs more than you were expecting, then instead of buying an expensive refrigerator, you put up with something else. And it's that trading that I think we've lost through the contract, because what we do is when that happens is we go and say, what did it say in the contract? And I think we have to get back to grown-up conversations where people understand the boundaries that they're working to. So a limited budget and a need to change, not making a profit, or the environment has changed. You know, we've lost the ability to negotiate and act as adults. We automatically say, well, what does the contract change? And I think for me, we just need to get better at those things. Actually, that's my view, Bob.
But that means not changing the contracts, just getting used to the fact that the wording is going to stay the same, but our behaviour is going to be different.
But yeah, I do. But I mean, if the way the contract works is you then write another thing that says over this period, what you're going to deliver is now X. We've agreed, you know, when you've agreed it,
yeah,
you then write down what you've agreed to and deliver that. I don't think you can have no contract, because then you don't know what you're lost. You know, if you don't have a map, then you really are lost. And for me, a contract is the map, not the terrain. You know, it just lays out the ways you're going to work together in order to deliver in your benefits, because we all want the benefits. And if some of those are changing, I work on the Palace of Buckingham Palace. You know, COVID has made some differences to it. We've sat down and say, you know, what can we now afford? How will it work? What can we do? But we've had grown-up conversations, and then we've written that down and said, right, we've agreed what we're going to do going forward. Now let's do it. And a contract should maybe be a developing thing rather than a static thing, which we go back to 10 years later and say, what did we all say?
That's right.
David, the arrangement at T5, that was a new form of words, wasn't it? It was a sort of like a partnering arrangement, wasn't it? Rather than,
yes, it was. I mean,
yeah,
it was. We worked with people to develop the schedule, and instead of telling them how much things would cost, we worked with them, and if things cost more than we expected, but we agreed between us and the contractor what the program was. You know, the T5 agreement, as it was called, was an agreement which said how we'll behave, and we had escalation ladders so that if we had problems, we would, you know, what you don't want is a £500 problem causing £10,000 worth of delay. You know, and so we had all those things, and it was a behavioural contract.
Yeah. Very good. So yes, grown-up conversations. I think I saw David Dunning's hand up. I don't know whether you're still with us, David, but you're welcome to come forward if you're there still.
Yeah. Hello, guys. Very interesting conversation. Slightly out of my domain. The one question I'd ask is, what do you believe the importance of accountability is, and mapping out the accountability network underneath the directors and between the project controls people? It feels like there's a lot of effort goes into compliance and standards and all that, making people do stuff the same way type stuff bottom up, when maybe a little bit of effort to nail down the accountability and sort out the governance might make life a little bit more easy to connect bottom to top and back again. I mean,
I'm not for mapping out stuff to a great, because we end up doing an awful lot of academic exercises. My worst project at the moment is the ACM cladding. I'm responsible for getting the cladding removed off nearly 100 buildings that are clad with ACM cladding following the Grenfell disaster. The more I'm taking off, the more I'm realising that if people aren't kept an eye on, they don't actually do what they even said they were going to do. So when you talk about accountability, you know, again, I think digital is going to help a great deal. We're going to start having digital photographs. We're going to know the person who's done X, Y, and Z. And understanding everybody's, we should be back to professionalism and competency. I think it's been eroded in the construction industry. I think both a level of pride the level of competency and a level, all those things have gone. And I think professional institutions have a real responsibility to get those people to care about what they do. One of the things about Terminal 5, you talk to anybody on Terminal 5, we didn't have accountability diagrams, racy diagrams or anything. You knew that what you were building, you would be held to account to at some time if it went wrong. In the same way that anybody, if you were an architect, you were responsible for the architecture. If you were project controls, you were responsible, for giving the best advice you could on the schedule, how it would be managed. I mean, I still remember the head of project controls, Steve Elliott, brilliant guy, who was on there and who kept the ship you're like the navigator. You don't steer the ship, but you tell it where it's going and where it's not going and all the rest of it. And I think you have to be very careful with accountability, because what are you accountable for is quite, in some cases, unless you're the person putting on the ACM clad or the cladding, or the person putting the fire breaks in and you've put them in upside down, or you haven't bothered to put them in, otherwise, the accountability mainly is with the people doing the work. So I'm not for drawing all those accountability diagrams. If you don't know what you're accountable for, then my job, you're probably not doing the right job.
Okay, thank you. I think time for a final one from Alan Glasgow. Alan.
Hi. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I thought that was covered some very interesting stuff there. My own background is building nuclear submarines and oil and gas industry, and I do agree with your view about transitioning to the predict risk and prevent philosophy. I just wondered, there's a lot being talked about accelerating pace on projects at the minute, and if we could actually carry out that predict and prevent philosophy effectively on construction and commissioning activities, that would be in terms of delivering major projects faster?
I mean, I think it would be. I mean, again, standardization will help us in some cases. Bespoke in everything doesn't help all the time. And as you know, with nuclear submarines, first of class is one of those things which is always a nightmare, the first of class. Now, I know because I work on ships, I'm working on the T-26 and stuff. But you give yourself a hell of a lot of time we're giving ourselves a lot of time on the first of class, because what we're going to do is build 5 others like it when we get it right. And in some cases, we never get to first of class in construction, because we build the first one and then we want to change the next one rather than learn from the first one. So that's why I say I think shipbuilding is closer to some of the stuff we should be closer to some of the stuff we do on railways. I think what pace does is it slows down the first one, but then you say the next 5 you can build much faster because you've learned. There is learning to be had. Quite often I sometimes wonder what, and somebody I think was mentioned right at the beginning, what is the learning from HS1 to HS2? Who takes that learning? And in actual fact, what is the connect? How similar was HS1 to HS2? Because when you actually look at them, there's no correlation whatsoever. They just seem to be called HS1 and HS2. And it's a bit like me if I came to you and said, well, a submarine's just like a ship. We built a submarine. We must be able to build a submarine catching T-26. But you would be horrified because you know the differences. But to the people, they just see that. And I think in some cases there isn't enough emphasis put on experience and knowing those kind of things, but also repeatability. We can get pace up if we build a first of class and then build 25 others. If everyone is bespoke, we will not get any pace.
Okay.
Good question, Alan.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Moving on, I would very much like to thank David for showing the human side of projects. It isn't all about Gantt charts. It's very much about people and as he said, the grown-up conversation. I think that's what makes the world go round, and a pleasanter place to live in as well. So I certainly wish you well, David, in your next 18 months or so at girding up construction and infrastructure. We're all gagging to help you, I imagine, and hopefully we shall be able to make a contribution that benefits us as well as the country. So your reward is a poem from poet Paul, who's popped up, ready to go. Second prize was 2 poems. So here's Paul's poem.
Just to get one back on the industry people there, Steve, for that little remark. I have just actually a mini project for HS1 and HS2, which is 40 poems by the community on display at St Pancras Station. And my mini project of 40 poems went up on time for National Poetry Day and to budget. As far as I know to this point, it's the only time HS1 and HS2 have done anything to budget, okay, and time. So, but not to go down that track. This poem has got a bit of a retro title, because I'm aware that a lot of your participants, have kind of got their early years in the 70s, in the 1970s and so forth. Apart from you, Natalie, obviously this won't mean a lot to you, this title, as you're a 90s new build. But this poem is called I'll Risk It for a Biscuit. A flowing conversation into managing intensity and oversight. Mega project, big projects, even go to projects are us. Either way, all projects take guts. Start with a vision, complexity versus complicated. Garden shed versus the shard. Each in their own way is hard. Transparency, the spaghetti western of the build. Come high noon, the date with no name must be fulfilled. It may cost a few dollars more. Aim for the Morrison and you might just hit the Fortnum and Mason. Cost, time, and the quality is in the eye of the beholder. The variable market forces are strong. Ask project manager Yoda. Bureaucracy is around every corner, and there is no one to say you're getting colder or warmer. Giving yourself the time and space rather than spinning play after play. Time to stop, time to look, time to make it right. Don't be an amber gambler at the traffic lights. Crisis doesn't wait for you to have a meeting, and history has a history of repeating. Try forward looking, wearing degree of confidence tinted glasses. Trust to trust, access to access, a safer passage. Every now and then, we all wander through a conundrum catacomb. Try seeing the whole of the moon. Articulate, motivate, and you create the great escape. Variables to the left, uncertainty to the right. Hold tight as into the valley of death between project conception and delivery. It's nearly Christmas. Nobody wants them. Someone please stop the cavalry.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Well done.
Do I get a copy of that?
You certainly do. And Paul will give you a performed video over the weekend as well. So we bang that out and issue it the following Monday.
All
so
right.
Yes, indeed. Once again, thank you again. Very brief message this week. We have, well, I'm actually being interviewed for a project podcast by, is it Dale and Val, tomorrow, discussing earned value, the rise and fall of earned value and the rise again of earned value. I'm recording that tomorrow, so I think it'll be issued on Monday. I'll send you some links so you can all enjoy that, in inverted commas. Next week, following up from Martin Paver's jaunt into data analytics and banging the drum about it, we have a practitioner, Evan Elliott from BMT will be coming to talk to us and give us at least 6 practical tips and guidance on how to do data analytics effectively and efficiently. So until then, it's raining here in London. I don't know whether it's raining where you are. Hopefully it will stop soon. It's getting cold, so keep warm. Look forward to your vaccine. I know that David and I are going to be near the top of the list. And see you next week, next Thursday. Have a safe week. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Natalie. Thanks for your questions.
Thanks, Natalie.
Thanks, David. Have a good evening.
Thanks all.